Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cold concrete wall of the makeshift prison cell, listening to the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the humid jungle air. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump made her heart race with both hope and dread. Hope because it might be a rescue mission. Dread because she knew those weren't friendly aircraft circling overhead. 3 weeks had passed since her Black Hawk helicopter was shot down during a reconnaissance mission over the contested border region between Colombia and Venezuela. 3 weeks since she watched her co-pilot Danny bleed out in the twisted wreckage, while enemy soldiers dragged her unconscious body from the smoking aircraft. 3 weeks since she became a prisoner of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, a militant group that had been terrorizing the region for over a decade. The rebels who captured her had no idea they were holding one of the most skilled helicopter pilots in the U.S. Army. To them, she was just another American soldier, valuable only as a bargaining chip or propaganda tool. They saw a young woman in torn fatigues, barely 5 feet tall with cuts and bruises covering her arms and face. What they didn't see was the daughter of a crop duster pilot who had been flying aircraft since she was 12 years old, or the graduate of the Army's most elite flight training program. Sarah had spent every waking moment in captivity studying her surroundings, memorizing guard rotations, and observing the enemy's operations. The rebel camp was larger than she initially thought, housing nearly 200 fighters and their families. They had turned an abandoned mining facility deep in the jungle into their headquarters, complete with weapons stockpiles, communication, equipment, and a small fleet of stolen military vehicles. But what caught her attention most was the helicopter pad carved out of the jungle canopy about half a mile from the main compound. Through the bars of her cell window, she could see 3 aircraft parked there, 2 older Russian-made Mi-8 transport helicopters, and 1 newer attack helicopter that made her blood run cold. It was an American-made AH-64 Apache, likely captured, or stolen from a government raid gone wrong. The Apache was her ticket out of this nightmare, but first she had to convince her captors that she was nothing more than a helpless prisoner. Every day when the guards brought her meager rations of rice and beans, she acted weak and defeated. She stumbled when they forced her to walk to the makeshift bathroom. She flinched at loud noises and kept her eyes downcast when the camp commander, a scarred man named Carlos Vega, came to interrogate her. Vega was convinced that Sarah possessed valuable intelligence about American military operations in the region. Day after day, he demanded information about troop movements, supply routes, and planned attacks. Sarah fed him carefully crafted lies mixed with just enough truth to keep him interested, but never enough to be useful. She told him about training, exercises she remembered from years past, described outdated equipment specifications, and gave him the names of soldiers who had already rotated back to the United States. The interrogations were brutal. Vega's men used psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and threats of violence to try to break her. They played recordings of helicopter crashes on loop, knowing her traumatic experience in the downed Black Hawk. They showed her photos of other captured soldiers who hadn't been as cooperative as she was pretending to be. But Sarah endured it all, drawing strength from her training and the knowledge that every day she stayed alive was another day closer to escape. During the long hours alone in her cell, Sarah planned every detail of her escape. She had identified the best route, from the prison building to the helicopter pad, noting which guards were most alert and which seemed bored with their duties. She knew that the Apache was fueled and armed, having overheard mechanics discussing maintenance schedules. Most importantly, she had discovered that the rebels were planning a major offensive against a nearby government outpost which would draw most of their forces away from the camp. The opportunity she had been waiting for finally arrived on a sweltering Tuesday morning. Sarah woke to the sound of engines starting and men shouting orders across the compound. Through her window, she watched as dozens of fighters loaded into trucks and the 2 Mi-8 helicopters, preparing for what their radio chatter suggested would be a coordinated attack on multiple targets. As the convoy departed, leaving behind only a skeleton crew to guard the camp, Sarah knew this was her moment. The Apache sat unguarded on the landing pad, its weapons systems loaded and ready. All she had to do was get there without being detected, and she would have the most powerful weapon in the rebel arsenal under her control. But first, she had to deal with the 2 guards posted outside her cell, Miguel and Roberto were young fighters, probably no more than 18 years old, who spent most of their time playing cards and complaining about missing the action with the main force. They had grown comfortable around their seemingly harmless prisoner, often leaving her cell door unlocked while they smoked cigarettes in the corridor. Sarah waited until the guards settled into their afternoon routine, then began groaning and calling for help in Spanish. When Miguel approached her cell to see what was wrong, she was doubled over on her cot, clutching her stomach and gasping in apparent agony. The concerned guard unlocked the door and stepped inside to check on her, followed reluctantly by Roberto. In one fluid motion, Sarah struck Miguel in the throat with the edge of her hand, while simultaneously kicking Roberto's knee with enough force to drop him to the ground. Before either guard could react or cry out, she had them both unconscious and was stripping Miguel of his weapons and radio. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Dressed in Miguel's oversized fatigues with his AK-47 slung across her shoulder, Sarah looked like just another rebel fighter from a distance. She pulled his cap low over her face and walked confidently through the compound, nodding casually to the few remaining guards as she made her way toward the helicopter pad. Her heart pounded with each step, knowing that discovery would mean certain death, but her training kept her moving forward with purpose and determination. The Apache grew larger as she approached, its sleek black frame gleaming in the filtered, jungle sunlight. Sarah had flown attack helicopters before, but never one quite like this. She would have to adapt quickly to its controls and weapon systems while under extreme pressure. As she reached the aircraft and began her pre-flight checks, she whispered a prayer that her skills would be enough to turn the tables on her captors and escape this green hell once and for all. Sarah's hands moved across the Apache's control panel with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over as adrenaline coursed through her veins. The aircraft's systems hummed to life under her touch, each switch and button falling into place as naturally as breathing. She had studied this particular model during advanced training at Fort Rucker, though she never imagined she would be starting one up while dressed as an enemy combatant in the middle of hostile territory. The rotor blades began their slow rotation as the engines spooled up, creating a low whine that would soon alert every remaining guard in the compound. Sarah knew she had perhaps 3 minutes before someone realized what was happening and raised the alarm. 3 minutes to complete her startup sequence, lift off, and put enough distance between herself and the camp to avoid the surface-to-air missiles she had spotted in the weapons depot. Through the cockpit glass, she caught sight of movement near the main compound buildings. A guard was pointing in her direction, his mouth open as he shouted warnings that were drowned out by the increasing rotor noise. Sarah cursed under her breath and accelerated her startup procedures, skipping several safety checks that would have to wait for more peaceful circumstances. The radio crackled to life with frantic Spanish voices demanding to know who was in the helicopter. Sarah grabbed the handset and responded in her best approximation of Miguel's voice, claiming she was conducting a routine maintenance check as ordered by Commander Vega. The deception bought her another precious minute, as confused voices argued over the radio about whether such an order had actually been given. As the Apache's rotors reached operational speed, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft wanting to lift off. She had always loved this moment in any helicopter, the point where tons of metal and machinery transformed into something that could defy gravity. But today, that feeling was tinged with desperation and the knowledge that failure meant death or a return to captivity that would be far worse than what she had already endured. The first gunshots rang out as Sarah pulled collective and felt the Apache rise from the landing pad. Rifle bullets pinged harmlessly off the aircraft's armored hull as she climbed rapidly through the jungle canopy, branches and leaves whipping past the cockpit windows. The rebels on the ground scrambled for heavier weapons, but Sarah was already 300 feet up and accelerating toward the relative safety of open sky. Her initial plan had been simple: fly the stolen Apache to the nearest government base and turn herself in to friendly forces. But as she cleared the treetops and got her first clear view of the surrounding terrain, Sarah realized the situation was far more complicated than she had anticipated. Smoke was rising from multiple locations across the valley, and her radio was picking up emergency transmissions from government units under attack. The rebels' offensive was already underway, and from her vantage point above the jungle, Sarah could see that it was massive in scope. Dozens of vehicles and hundreds of fighters were moving along jungle roads toward government positions. The two Mi-8 transport helicopters she had seen leaving the camp earlier were visible in the distance, ferrying troops to forward positions and providing close air support with door-mounted machine guns. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of fleeing to safety, she banked the Apache toward the sound of gunfire, determined to use her stolen aircraft to help the government forces who were being overwhelmed by the rebel assault. It was a dangerous choice, one that went against every survival instinct and military protocol, but she couldn't abandon fellow soldiers to die when she had the power to help them. The first government position she reached was a small outpost, built around an abandoned gas station at a crossroads deep in the jungle. About 30 government soldiers were pinned down by rebel forces attacking from 3 directions, their defensive perimeter shrinking as enemy fighters closed in. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the tree line and the distinctive trails of rocket-propelled grenades arcing toward the besieged outpost. She announced her presence by firing a burst from the Apache's 30mm chain gun into a cluster of rebel fighters advancing across an open field. The explosive rounds tore through their ranks, sending survivors diving for cover and buying the defenders precious breathing room. Sarah's radio immediately erupted with confused voices as both government and rebel forces tried to identify the mysterious helicopter that had just entered the battle. The government commander at the outpost, a veteran sergeant named Rodriguez, was the first to figure out what was happening. His excited voice came through on the emergency frequency, reporting that an unknown pilot in a captured enemy helicopter was providing close air support. Sarah responded in English, identifying herself as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, U.S. Army, and requesting immediate coordination with government forces. What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense combat flying of Sarah's career. She used the Apache's advanced targeting systems to identify and eliminate rebel machine gun nests that were raking the government positions with deadly fire. Her Hellfire missiles took out 2 technical vehicles mounted with heavy weapons, while her chain gun kept enemy infantry from advancing across open ground. The rebels, meanwhile, were struggling to understand how their own helicopter had turned against them. Radio intercepts revealed mass confusion in their ranks as field commanders demanded explanations from the base camp, only to learn that their prize aircraft had been stolen by the escaped American prisoner. Some rebel units began retreating, fearing that the government had somehow captured additional enemy helicopters. Sarah's intervention tipped the balance at the gas station outpost, allowing the government forces to break out of their defensive positions and counterattack. But her ammunition was running low, and she knew that more rebel forces would be converging on her position as word of the stolen Apache spread throughout their communication network. As she prepared to move to the next embattled government position, Sarah's radar warning system began screaming alerts. Somewhere in the jungle below, rebel forces had activated a surface-to-air missile system, and she was being painted by targeting radar. The hunters had become the hunted, and Sarah found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse with an enemy that now knew exactly what they were dealing with. She threw the Apache into a violent evasive maneuver, just as the first missile streaked past her cockpit, its proximity fuse detonating close enough to pepper the aircraft's hull with shrapnel. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel as secondary systems failed, but the helicopter remained flyable. Sarah dove toward the jungle canopy, using the dense vegetation to break the missile system's radar lock while planning her next move. The rebels had underestimated her once, seeing only a helpless captive when they should have recognized a warrior. Now they knew better, but Sarah was determined to make them pay for every lesson learned. The stolen Apache might be damaged, but it was still the most powerful weapon in the sky, and she intended to use every missile, every bullet, and every ounce of her skill to turn their own helicopter against them. Sarah kept the Apache low and fast, skimming just above the jungle canopy as she raced toward the next crisis point. Her radar warning receiver had gone quiet after her evasive maneuvers, but she knew the surface-to-air missile threat was still out there, waiting for her to climb high enough to acquire a clean lock. The rebels were learning to adapt to their new reality. Their most valuable prisoner had become their deadliest enemy. The government radio frequencies were alive with reports of attacks across a 50-mile front. Rebel forces had simultaneously struck 6 different positions, stretching the government's limited resources to the breaking point. Sarah quickly realized that this wasn't just a random offensive, but a carefully coordinated campaign designed to capture a strategic river crossing that would give the rebels access to major population centers. Her next destination was a government checkpoint protecting a vital bridge across the Magdalena River. Intelligence reports indicated that nearly 200 rebel fighters were converging on the position, supported by mortars and at least one of the Mi-8 helicopters she had seen. Leaving the camp earlier, the 30 government soldiers defending the bridge were requesting immediate air support, reporting that they were already running low on ammunition. As Sarah approached the river, she could see the scope of the rebel assault developing below. Enemy fighters were advancing through the jungle on both sides of the road, while their mortar teams had set up firing positions on a ridge overlooking the government checkpoint. The Mi-8 transport helicopter was making gun runs against the defenders, its door gunners raking the checkpoint with machine gun fire that forced the soldiers to keep their heads down. Sarah's first priority was neutralizing the enemy helicopter. The Mi-8 was older and less maneuverable than her Apache, but its crew had the advantage of knowing the terrain and could use the jungle canopy for cover. She climbed to attack altitude and activated the Apache's sophisticated targeting system, waiting for the enemy aircraft to present a clear shot. The opportunity came when the Mi-8 made another gun run against the checkpoint, exposing itself as it flew directly over the river. Sarah fired a single Hellfire missile, watching through her targeting screen as the precision-guided weapon tracked toward its target. The Mi-8's pilot spotted the incoming missile at the last second and tried to evade, but it was too late. The explosion lit up the jungle as burning wreckage crashed into the river, eliminating one of the rebels' most valuable assets. With the enemy helicopter destroyed, Sarah turned her attention to the mortar positions on the ridge. The Apache's thermal imaging system made it easy to spot the rebel crews, their body heat standing out clearly against the cooler jungle background. She used her chain gun to systematically eliminate each mortar team, watching through her targeting display as the 30mm explosive rounds found their marks. The government forces at the checkpoint took advantage of the suppressing fire to reorganize their defense and begin pushing back against the rebel infantry assault. Sarah provided close air support, using her remaining Hellfire missiles to destroy technical vehicles and concentrations of enemy fighters. But she was acutely aware that her ammunition was running dangerously low, and more rebel forces were still approaching the area. Commander Vega's voice suddenly cut through the radio chatter on the rebel frequency, his barely controlled rage evident even through the static. He was personally taking command of the operation to recapture the stolen Apache, promising substantial rewards to whoever could bring down the traitorous American pilot. Sarah smiled grimly as she listened to his threats, knowing that her escape had clearly struck a nerve with the rebel leader. The next phase of her mission took her to a government patrol that had been ambushed while attempting to reinforce the bridge checkpoint. 20 soldiers were trapped in a clearing surrounded by rebel forces, their vehicle destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade and their radio operator wounded. Sarah arrived just as the rebels were preparing to overrun the position, their fighters closing in from all sides. Running low on missiles, Sarah had to rely primarily on her chain gun for this engagement. She made multiple strafing runs around the perimeter of the clearing, her accurate fire forcing the rebel attackers to withdraw into the jungle. The precision required for close air support in such tight quarters tested every aspect of her training, as she had to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces while engaging targets only meters away from government soldiers. The rescue operation was complicated by the fact that several of the government soldiers were wounded and couldn't be moved quickly. Sarah used the Apache's loudspeaker system to communicate directly with the patrol leader, coordinating a fighting withdrawal toward a landing zone where medical evacuation helicopters could reach them safely. She provided continuous overhead cover as the soldiers carried their wounded comrades through the jungle, engaging any rebel fighters who tried to pursue. But the rebels were adapting to her tactics and had begun using her own weapons against her. Intelligence intercepts revealed that they had moved additional surface-to-air missile systems into the area, creating an increasingly dangerous environment for helicopter operations. Sarah's radar warning receiver began detecting multiple targeting radars, indicating that the rebels were attempting to box her in with overlapping missile coverage. The situation became critical when Sarah's fuel gauge dropped into the red zone. The Apache was a powerful aircraft, but its high-performance engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate during combat operations. She had been flying at maximum power for nearly 2 hours, and her fuel reserves were approaching the point where she would be forced to land or risk running dry in mid-flight. Sarah made the difficult decision to break off her support mission and search for a suitable landing zone where she could refuel. The Apache's fuel system was compatible with standard aviation gas, and she remembered seeing a small airstrip marked on her navigation charts about 20 miles to the east. If the facility was still operational, she might be able to refuel and continue her one-woman war against the rebel forces. As she turned toward the airstrip, Sarah's radar warning system erupted with alerts. Multiple surface-to-air missiles had been launched simultaneously, their targeting radars locked onto her aircraft from different directions. The rebels had finally coordinated their missile systems effectively, creating a trap that would be almost impossible to evade. Sarah threw the Apache into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, diving toward the jungle floor while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missiles' guidance systems. 2 of the missiles lost lock and detonated harmlessly in the distance, but the third continued tracking toward her aircraft with deadly accuracy. The missile's proximity fuse activated just as Sarah pulled the Apache into a steep climbing turn, the explosion close enough to shatter several cockpit windows and send fragments of shrapnel through the aircraft's tail section. Warning lights flooded her instrument panel as hydraulic pressure dropped and electrical systems began failing. The stolen Apache was critically damaged but somehow still flying. Sarah leveled off just above the treetops, fighting to maintain control as the helicopter's flight characteristics changed dramatically. The aircraft was pulling hard to the left, indicating significant damage to the tail rotor system, and she could smell smoke beginning to fill the cockpit. She had minutes, maybe less, before the Apache would be unflyable. The small airstrip appeared ahead through the damaged windscreen, its single runway barely visible through the jungle canopy. Sarah began her approach, knowing that this might be the most difficult landing of her career. The Apache was barely responding to her inputs, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that suggested critical components were on the verge of complete failure. As she flared for landing, Sarah caught sight of movement around the airstrip buildings. Armed figures were emerging from concealment, and she realized with growing dread that the rebels had anticipated her destination and prepared another trap. She was about to land a critically damaged helicopter directly into the hands of her enemies, with no ammunition left and nowhere else to run. Sarah's mind raced through her limited options as the damaged Apache descended toward the airstrip. The rebels below had positioned themselves strategically around the runway, their weapons trained on her aircraft as it struggled through its final approach. Landing would mean certain capture or death, but the helicopter's failing systems gave her no choice in the matter. At the last possible moment, Sarah made a desperate decision. Instead of attempting a controlled landing on the runway, she pulled the collective and used what little power remained to carry the Apache over the rebel positions toward a fuel truck parked near the airstrip's maintenance hangar. If she was going down, she would take as many enemies with her as possible. The Apache hit the fuel truck with tremendous force, the impact sending both aircraft and vehicle tumbling across the tarmac in a shower of sparks and aviation fuel. Sarah was thrown forward against her restraints as the world spun around her, metal screaming against concrete and glass exploding inward from the cockpit windows. When the wreckage finally came to rest against the side of the hangar, everything was eerily quiet except for the sound of fuel dripping onto hot metal. Sarah forced herself to move despite the pain radiating through her ribs and left shoulder. The cockpit was filled with smoke, and she could smell gasoline vapor that meant fire was inevitable. She had perhaps 30 seconds to extract herself from the wreckage before the entire area went up in flames. Her training kicked in automatically as she released her harnesses and kicked out the remaining fragments of the side window. The rebels were already moving toward the crash site, their initial shock giving way to anger and determination. Sarah could hear Commander Vega's voice over their radio, screaming orders for his men to capture her alive if possible, but to shoot to kill if she resisted. She grabbed Miguel's AK-47 from where it had fallen during the crash and checked the magazine. 15 rounds remained, not nearly enough for a prolonged firefight, but better than nothing. Sarah crawled out of the burning Apache just as the first rebel fighters rounded the corner of the hangar. She opened fire immediately, her accurate shooting dropping 2 men and sending the others diving for cover behind concrete barriers and parked vehicles. The brief firefight gave her the precious seconds needed to reach a drainage ditch that ran alongside the airstrip, providing minimal cover, but at least concealing her exact position. The fuel truck finally exploded, sending a mushroom cloud of orange flame and black smoke into the jungle sky. The blast wave knocked several rebels to the ground and shattered windows throughout the small airfield complex. Sarah used the confusion to low crawl along the drainage ditch toward a cluster of storage buildings at the far end of the runway, hoping to find better defensive positions or perhaps another way out of her current predicament. But the rebels had learned from their previous encounters with the resourceful American pilot. Instead of rushing her position, they began a methodical sweep of the area, using suppressing fire to keep her pinned down while teams moved to flank her position from multiple directions. Sarah found herself trapped in the drainage ditch with enemies approaching from 3 sides and open ground behind her. Commander Vega arrived at the airstrip in a commandeered jeep, his scarred face twisted with rage as he surveyed the destruction. The loss of the Apache represented a devastating blow to his organization's capabilities, and Sarah's escape had made him look weak in front of his subordinates. He was determined to recapture her personally and make an example that would restore his authority. Sarah counted her remaining ammunition and realized that she had enough for perhaps one more brief engagement before running dry. The rebels were close enough now that she could hear their whispered communications as they coordinated their final assault. She had to make her shots count, and then find some other way to continue fighting or escaping from this increasingly hopeless situation. The attack came from 2 directions simultaneously, with rebel fighters emerging from behind storage buildings, while others advanced along the drainage ditch from the opposite direction. Sarah engaged the closer threat first, her controlled bursts dropping one attacker and wounding another before swinging toward the flanking force. But her ammunition ran out just as more rebels appeared, and she was forced to throw aside the empty rifle. Sarah surrendered herself to the inevitable and raised her hands, expecting to be shot down immediately or dragged back to face Vega's revenge. Instead, the rebel commander himself appeared at the edge of the ditch, his pistol trained on her chest but his expression showing something closer to grudging respect than pure hatred. He had finally cornered his elusive prey, but the cost had been enormous. Vega ordered his men to search Sarah thoroughly before binding her hands behind her back with rope. They found no additional weapons, but the rebel leader was taking no chances with a prisoner who had already escaped once and caused so much damage to his organization. He posted 6 guards around her and gave strict orders that she was to be watched constantly until they could return her to a more secure location. As Sarah was loaded into the back of a truck for transport, she noticed that the rebels seemed nervous and kept glancing at the jungle around the airstrip. Their radio communications revealed that government forces were moving in response to the smoke column from the destroyed fuel truck, and there were reports of approaching helicopters from multiple directions. Her dramatic escape and subsequent combat operations had attracted attention from higher up the chain of command. The truck convoy began moving along a narrow jungle road, but their progress was slow due to the poor conditions and the need to watch for government patrols. Sarah sat quietly in the back of the lead vehicle, her hands bound but her mind still working on possible escape scenarios. She had been captured again, but the situation was very different from her first imprisonment. This time, the rebels knew exactly what she was capable of, and they would be taking no chances with security. But Sarah also knew that her actions over the past few hours had fundamentally changed the tactical situation in the region. The destruction of enemy aircraft and equipment, combined with the intelligence she had gathered during her escape, would be invaluable to government forces planning their next operations. Even if she couldn't escape again, she had already struck a significant blow against the rebel organization. Commander Vega rode in the passenger seat of the lead truck, occasionally turning to stare at his recaptured prisoner with a mixture of anger and grudging admiration. He had never encountered anyone quite like Sarah Martinez, and her resourcefulness had cost him dearly. The Apache alone was worth millions of dollars, not to mention the other equipment and personnel lost during her brief but devastating aerial campaign. The convoy had traveled only a few miles when Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up a familiar sound in the distance. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors was growing steadily louder, approaching from the direction of the government-controlled territory to the east. She allowed herself a small smile as she recognized the specific acoustic signature of military aircraft flying in formation. Vega heard it too, and his expression changed from confidence to concern as he realized that his convoy was about to be discovered by government forces. He ordered the vehicles to increase speed and seek cover under the jungle canopy, but the narrow road offered few options for concealment. The sound of approaching helicopters continued to grow louder, suggesting multiple aircraft operating in coordinated search patterns. Sarah's brief moment of hope was tempered by the knowledge that any rescue attempt would be extremely dangerous in the dense jungle terrain. Government forces would have to locate the moving convoy, distinguish her from her captors, and execute a precision operation without causing her death in the crossfire. The odds were not encouraging, but they were better than anything she had faced since her original capture 3 weeks earlier. The first government helicopter appeared through a gap in the jungle canopy, its thermal imaging system undoubtedly detecting the heat signatures of the vehicles below. Sarah tensed as she heard the pilot's voice over the rebel radio frequency, demanding that the convoy stop immediately and surrender all prisoners unharmed. Vega's response was a string of curses followed by orders for his men to prepare for combat. The final phase of Sarah's ordeal was about to begin, and she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether she would finally taste freedom or die in the jungle alongside her captors. The hunters and the hunted were about to reverse roles one more time, but the outcome remained far from certain. The government helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their rotor wash creating violent downdrafts that sent leaves and debris swirling through the jungle canopy. Sarah could make out at least 3 aircraft through gaps in the foliage, 2 attack helicopters providing cover and 1 transport helicopter that would presumably extract her if a rescue could be executed successfully. The professional part of her mind admired the tactical formation, while simultaneously calculating the extreme difficulty of the mission they were attempting. Commander Vega barked orders into his radio, coordinating with other rebel units scattered throughout the jungle. Sarah's enhanced hearing caught fragments of the conversations, revealing that the rebels had surface-to-air missiles positioned at multiple locations along the road. They were preparing to create a killing zone that would make any rescue attempt prohibitively costly for the government forces. Vega clearly intended to use Sarah as a human shield while extracting maximum casualties from her would-be rescuers. The truck convoy came to an abrupt halt as the lead vehicle's driver spotted government soldiers moving through the jungle ahead. A full company of elite troops had been deployed to support the rescue operation, their distinctive camouflage uniforms barely visible as they took positions among the dense vegetation. Sarah realized that this was no hasty response but a carefully planned operation that had been developing while she was creating chaos with the stolen Apache. Vega grabbed Sarah by her bound arms and dragged her from the truck, pressing the muzzle of his pistol against her temple as he used her body to shield himself from potential sniper fire. His men quickly established a defensive perimeter around the vehicles, their weapons trained outward as they prepared for what would likely be their final battle. The rebels knew they were outgunned and outnumbered, but their desperate situation made them extremely dangerous. The government commander's voice echoed through a loudspeaker mounted on one of the hovering helicopters, offering safe passage for any rebels who surrendered immediately and released their prisoner unharmed. Vega's response was to fire several shots into the air with his free hand, while keeping his pistol pressed against Sarah's head. The negotiation phase was clearly over before it had begun. Sarah felt the cold metal of the gun barrel against her skin and knew that she was running out of time. Vega was growing increasingly agitated as government forces continued to close in around his position, and desperate men with guns made fatal mistakes. She had to find a way to create an opportunity for her rescuers while simultaneously protecting herself from becoming a casualty in the crossfire that was about to erupt. The first shots came from a government sniper positioned high in the jungle canopy. his precision rifle taking out one of the rebel machine gunners who had been setting up to engage the helicopters overhead. The sound of the suppressed weapon was barely audible above the rotor noise, but the effect was immediate as rebels dove for cover and began firing wildly into the surrounding jungle. Sarah felt Vega's grip tighten on her arm as he pulled her toward better cover behind one of the trucks, but his attention was divided between watching for government soldiers and trying to coordinate his men's defense. She waited for the precise moment when his focus shifted entirely to the tactical situation, then struck backward with her elbow, catching him in the solar plexus with enough force to double him over. The rebel commander's grip loosened just enough for Sarah to twist away from his pistol, but his recovery was faster than she had anticipated. Vega straightened up with murderous rage in his eyes and raised his weapon to execute her at point-blank range. Sarah closed her eyes and prepared for the inevitable, but the expected gunshot was followed by a different sound entirely. A government sniper's bullet caught Vega in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the underbrush. Sarah didn't hesitate, launching herself toward the fallen weapon while chaos erupted around her. Rebel fighters were engaging government positions from multiple directions, their automatic weapons creating a deafening wall of sound that made communication nearly impossible. Sarah's bound hands made it difficult to properly grip the recovered pistol, but she managed to position herself behind the truck's engine block as bullets began impacting the vehicle from several directions. Government forces were advancing through the jungle with professional precision, but the rebels were fighting with the desperation of cornered animals who knew their situation was hopeless. The battle reached its climax when one of the government attack helicopters made a low-level gun run along the road, its chain gun systematically destroying the rebel vehicles and eliminating several enemy positions. The devastating, accurate fire broke the back of the rebel defense, sending survivors fleeing into the jungle while government troops moved in to secure the area. Sarah remained behind cover until she heard English voices calling her name. Then, carefully emerged with her hands raised to avoid being mistaken for an enemy combatant. A government medic reached her first, quickly cutting the ropes around her wrists and checking her for injuries while other soldiers established a security perimeter around the crash site. Commander Vega lay wounded, but alive a few yards away, his shoulder bandaged by another medic despite the protests of several government soldiers who wanted to leave him to bleed out. Sarah looked down at the man who had been her captor and torturer, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Justice demanded that he face trial for his crimes, but she also understood that his capture would provide valuable intelligence about rebel operations throughout the region. The professional soldier in her recognized that Vega alive was worth more than Vega dead. The government unit commander, a weathered colonel named Ramirez, approached Sarah with obvious relief and professional respect. He had been briefed on her escape and subsequent aerial campaign, describing her actions as the most effective single-pilot operation he had witnessed in 20 years of jungle warfare. The stolen Apache had destroyed over $2 million worth of rebel equipment and saved dozens of government soldiers' lives before being shot down. As medics attended to her injuries and exhaustion, Sarah provided a rapid intelligence briefing on everything she had observed during her captivity and escape. The location of the main rebel camp, their communication frequencies, weapon stockpiles, and planned operations were all crucial information that could help government forces press their advantage. Her 3 weeks of careful observation were proving as valuable as her dramatic escape. The extraction helicopters arrived within minutes, their crews having monitored the entire rescue operation from nearby staging areas. Sarah was loaded aboard the lead aircraft alongside several wounded government soldiers, while Vega and 2 other captured rebels were secured in a separate compartment. The jungle battle was over, but Sarah knew that her intelligence would fuel operations against the rebel organization for months to come. As the transport helicopter climbed through the jungle canopy toward friendly territory, Sarah allowed herself to finally relax for the first time in weeks. The familiar vibration of rotor blades and the professional competence of the flight crew reminded her that she was no longer alone against overwhelming odds. She was going home, but her ordeal had fundamentally changed both her and the tactical situation in the contested border region. Colonel Ramirez sat across from her during the flight, reviewing preliminary reports from other government units that had benefited from her impromptu air support. The bridge checkpoint had held against the rebel assault, preventing enemy forces from reaching the strategic river crossing. The ambushed patrol had been successfully evacuated with minimal additional casualties. 2 rebel bases had been located and targeted based on intelligence she had provided during her brief radio contacts. The helicopter touched down at a secure government base just as the sun was setting over the jungle, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Sarah was immediately taken to a debriefing facility where intelligence officers waited to collect every detail of her experience. But first, she was allowed a hot shower, clean clothes, and her first real meal in 3 weeks. The simple pleasures of civilization felt almost overwhelming after her extended ordeal. During the lengthy debriefing sessions that followed, Sarah learned the full scope of what her escape had accomplished. The destruction of the Apache had forced the rebels to cancel several planned operations that depended on air support. The loss of experienced pilots and crew members had crippled their ability to conduct coordinated attacks. Most importantly, the psychological impact of having their most secure prisoner turn their own weapons against them had shaken rebel morale throughout the organization. Intelligence analysts estimated that Sarah's actions had set back rebel capabilities by at least 6 months, providing government forces with a crucial window of opportunity to press offensive operations. The captured communications equipment from Vega's convoy was already yielding valuable intelligence about rebel networks and planned attacks. Sarah's courage under fire had accomplished what entire military operations had failed to achieve. But the personal cost had been enormous. Sarah struggled with survivor's guilt over Danny's death in the original helicopter crash, and the violence she had witnessed and participated in during her escape would require months of counseling to process properly. The physical injuries from her crashes and captivity would heal, but the psychological wounds would take much longer to address. As news of her escape spread through military channels, Sarah found herself reluctantly transformed into a symbol of American military resilience and competence. Media requests poured in from around the world, all wanting to interview the pilot who had stolen an enemy helicopter and turned it against her captors. Sarah declined all interviews, preferring to focus on her recovery and eventual return to active duty. The final phase of her ordeal involved extensive medical evaluations and psychological assessments to determine her fitness for continued military service. Sarah's commanders were eager to have her back in the cockpit, recognizing that her experience and proven capabilities under extreme stress made her an invaluable asset, but they also understood that she needed time to process her trauma and regain her emotional equilibrium. 3 months after her rescue, Sarah stood on the flight line at her home base, preparing for her first training mission since the ordeal. The Apache helicopter before her was identical to the one she had stolen and crashed in the jungle, its sleek black frame gleaming in the morning sunlight. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the aircraft, muscle memory and trauma competing for control of her emotions. Her new co-pilot, a young warrant officer named Johnson, watched with obvious awe as Sarah began her pre-flight inspection. Every pilot in the unit knew her story, and many considered it an honor to fly with someone who had proven herself under such extraordinary circumstances. But Sarah was more interested in moving forward than dwelling on past achievements, focusing on the routine tasks that would help her regain confidence in her abilities. Sarah's hands moved across the Apache's controls with familiar confidence as she completed her pre-flight checks. But her mind kept drifting back to that terrible day in the jungle when everything had changed. 6 months had passed since her rescue, and she had finally been cleared for return to active flight duty after extensive physical therapy and psychological counseling. The scars on her arms had faded, but the memories remained as vivid as ever. Warrant. Officer Johnson settled into the co-pilot seat beside her, his youthful enthusiasm reminding Sarah of her own early days in aviation. He had graduated at the top of his flight class and specifically requested assignment to her unit, hoping to learn from someone who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Sarah appreciated his eagerness but worried that her reputation might create unrealistic expectations about what military service actually entailed. The mission briefing had been routine, a border patrol flight along the same general area where Sarah had been shot down months earlier. Intelligence reports suggested that rebel activity had decreased significantly following the destruction of their air assets and the capture of several key leaders, but vigilance remained essential. Sarah's commanding officer had chosen this particular mission deliberately, believing that returning to the scene of her ordeal would help her achieve psychological closure. As the Apache lifted off from the base and headed toward the jungle, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with helicopter flight. The sensation was both comforting and unsettling, reminding her of happier times while also triggering memories of her escape and subsequent aerial combat. She forced herself to focus on current tactical considerations rather than dwelling on past experiences that couldn't be changed. The jungle spread out below them like a green carpet, broken only by the occasional river or clearing where small settlements had carved out space among the dense vegetation. Sarah scanned the terrain through her targeting system, noting landmarks and potential landing zones while Johnson handled routine navigation and communication tasks. Everything appeared peaceful from their altitude, but Sarah knew better than to trust appearances in this part of the world. They were approaching the area where Sarah's original Black Hawk had been shot down when Johnson spotted something unusual through his binoculars. A thin column of smoke was rising from the jungle canopy about 2 miles south of their current position, too small and controlled to be a forest fire but large enough to indicate human activity. Sarah banked the Apache toward the smoke while radioing their base to report the potential contact. What they found as they circled overhead was the wreckage of Sarah's original helicopter, now partially overgrown with jungle vegetation, but still clearly recognizable. Someone had been burning debris near the crash site, possibly scavenging valuable components or conducting some kind of memorial service. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she saw the twisted metal where Danny had died, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure while Johnson called in the coordinates. A small group of figures emerged from the jungle near the wreck site, waving white cloth to signal their peaceful intentions. Through her magnified optics, Sarah could see that they were local villagers rather than rebel fighters, their body language indicating fear rather than hostility. Johnson suggested landing to investigate, but Sarah's hard-won experience made her cautious about trusting any situation that seemed too convenient or peaceful. Instead, she maintained a safe altitude, while using the Apache's loudspeaker system to communicate with the villagers below. Their leader, an elderly man with weathered features, explained in broken Spanish that they had been caring for the crash site and recovering personal effects from the wreckage. He held up a small bundle that Sarah recognized with shock as Danny's flight helmet, its distinctive marking still visible despite months of jungle exposure. The discovery of her co-pilot's helmet triggered a flood of emotions that Sarah had been suppressing since her rescue. Grief for a friend and fellow aviator who had died protecting his country. Guilt over surviving when he hadn't. Anger at the senseless violence that had torn their lives apart. But also determination to ensure that Danny's sacrifice hadn't been meaningless and that other pilots would learn from their experience. Sarah made the decision to land despite Johnson's expressed concerns about the tactical situation. The villagers had risked their own safety to preserve the dignity of an American serviceman's remains, and she owed them at least the courtesy of accepting their gesture personally. She set the Apache down in a small clearing while keeping the engines running and weapon systems active, ready for immediate departure if the situation deteriorated. The elderly villager approached the helicopter with obvious nervousness, clutching Danny's helmet along with several other personal items recovered from the wreckage. He spoke softly in Spanish, explaining that his grandson had been killed by rebel forces 2 years earlier, and he understood the pain of losing family to violence. The items belonged with Danny's loved ones, not rotting in the jungle where he had died. Sarah accepted the recovered items with tears in her eyes, her professional composure finally cracking as she held her dead friend's helmet. Johnson watched uncomfortably from the co-pilot seat, unsure how to respond to this unexpected display of raw emotion from someone he had viewed as almost superhuman. The young officer was getting his first real lesson about the human cost of military service. As they prepared to depart, the villager shared one final piece of information that made Sarah's blood run cold. Commander Vega had escaped from government custody during a prisoner transport 3 weeks earlier, killing 2 guards and disappearing back into the jungle with a small group of loyal followers. Intelligence agencies had been hunting him since, but he seemed to have vanished completely from their surveillance networks. The flight back to base was completed in tense silence, both pilots scanning the jungle below with heightened awareness of potential threats. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of Vega's escape, wondering if the rebel leader was planning some kind of revenge operation against her, or the government forces that had captured him. The psychological warfare aspect of their conflict was far from over, even though the immediate military threat had been largely neutralized. During the post-mission debriefing, Sarah shared the villagers' intelligence about Vega's escape with the operations staff, triggering immediate alerts and increased security measures throughout the region. Her commanding officer assigned additional protection to her quarters and modified her flight schedule to include armed escorts on all missions. The war against the rebels might be winding down, but personal vendettas could continue for years. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, carefully cleaning Danny's recovered helmet and preparing to ship his personal effects back to his family in Texas. The simple task helped her process the complex emotions triggered by returning to the crash site, while also providing a sense of closure that had been missing since her rescue. Her friend's death would always be a source of pain, but honoring his memory gave that sacrifice meaning. The knock on her door came just after midnight, followed by the voice of the duty officer reporting an urgent communication from intelligence headquarters. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way to the secure communications center, where analysts had been monitoring rebel radio traffic throughout the evening. What they had discovered would force her to confront Commander Vega one final time. Intercepted communications revealed that the escaped rebel leader was planning a suicide attack against the government base where Sarah was stationed, using a truck bomb loaded with stolen explosives. Vega's remaining followers were already in position around the perimeter, waiting for his signal to begin the assault. The attack was clearly motivated by personal revenge rather than strategic objectives, making it both more dangerous and more unpredictable than conventional military operations. Sarah realized with growing dread that her return to active duty had painted a target on everyone around her. Vega's obsession with revenge was placing hundreds of innocent soldiers and support personnel at risk, turning her personal conflict with the rebel commander into a threat to the entire base. She would have to find a way to end this cycle of violence before more people died because of their shared history. The final confrontation between Sarah Martinez and Carlos Vega was approaching, and this time, there would be no prisoners taken and no escape routes available. One of them would not survive the night, but Sarah was determined to ensure that it wouldn't be any of the soldiers under her protection. The helpless captive they had underestimated was about to become their final opponent, and she intended to finish what they had started in that jungle clearing so many months ago.